In the months before Silicon Valley Bank's collapse, SVB's lobbying groups fought a proposal requiring financial institutions to increase payments into the deposit insurance fund that protects depositors from bank failures, according to federal records reviewed by The Lever.
This comes after even more Lever reporting last week revealing that back in 2015, SVB's chief Gregory Becker lobbied Congress to reduce scrutiny of his financial institution, citing the, quote, low-risk profile of our activities and business model. Behind these two great pieces of reporting, joining us now to weigh in is reporter for The Lever, Julia Rock. Welcome back, Julia.
Thanks so much for having me on.
So this seems like a classic case of, the relevant people, the authorities in the institution, lobbying for favorable policies that will allow themselves to enrich themselves. But then when things go wrong, they want a government bailout. They want to help from Uncle Sam, from kind of indirectly, in this case at least, the U.S. taxpayer. What do you make of what's gone wrong here?
I mean, what you said is exactly right. Silicon Valley Bank, has been for over a decade now fighting for carve-outs to federal banking laws and regulations aimed at, forcing banks and regulators to conduct the type of oversight that obviously was not happening in this case. And it is, to your point, it sort of created the conditions for the bank's own destruction. The depositors were bailed out, but the bank did fail.
So this is really interesting because there has been a conversation about whether or not this is in fact a bailout and whether or not the money that is being used here is coming from the taxpayer. But what's so interesting about this piece of the story in particular is that there is, of course, a fund that is already set up, an insurance fund that these banks are supposed to be paying into that protects at least the first $250,000. And there has been lobbying specifically to not pay more into that fund in a way that would say keep the payout limited to what the banks had already paid in, as opposed to going further afield to wherever this money is coming from to cover the entirety of what the depositors had in Silicon Valley Bank. 90% of what was deposited in Silicon Valley Bank, of course, was not covered by the $250,000. So what do you make of this argument that the money that is being used is in fact a bailout, and people who say, well, maybe technically it can be attributed to taxpayer dollars in the same way that at the very least that people accuse other kinds of social services for the poor as being taxpayer funded?
Well, so it's unquestionably a bailout for a number of reasons. I mean, the first being that, as you say, these are uninsured depositors, so they're actually not guaranteed to get their deposits back. The deposit insurance fund you were mentioning that we wrote about is a fund that banks pay into. They're assessed premiums, as is true with other types of insurance, and it's supposed to cover depositors in the case of a collapse, cover insured depositors. But again, these are uninsured depositors. The money is coming from a number of different sources, including liquidating the bank's assets, the deposit insurance fund itself. FDIC says there will be an additional assessment, if there's not enough money to cover the depositors. But, all of this, of course, is backed by the U.S. federal government. There are other, facilities that are in maybe a clearer sense a bailout as well. The Federal Reserve has announced a lending facility specifically aimed at these losses, that interest rate hikes are causing for the value of government securities to drop. So there are all sorts of ways, that the government is intervening to help depositors that were promised they were not going to be bailed out by the government if, in fact, they lost their money.
Well, in a letter from Silicon Valley Bank CEO Tim Mayopoulos to his clients upon the bank's collapse, he wrote, "The number one thing you can do to support the future of this institution is to help us rebuild our deposit base. Both new and existing deposits are fully protected by the FDIC. This action by the FDIC effectively means that deposits held with SVB are among the safest of any bank or institution." Another letter where he said there is not a single safer place to keep or transfer your deposit than SVB. What do you make of that statement?
I mean, it is sort of like the joke's on all of us here by even saying in the first place that these were, uninsured deposits, because clearly the depositors knew, believed, continued to believe that, the government is going to step in when the time comes. So I think that's sort of what I make of a statement like that. Like, they all knew what was happening. there's no doubt, that they're going to get their money back. So why should we have ever believed that, these really were uninsured deposits?
Can you talk about the lobbying piece of this just a little bit more? Because this was a kind of Trump-era deregulations, but 17 Democrats did vote for these deregulatory laws as well. David Sirota has been doing a great job of highlighting the fact that Senator Mark Warner hosted a fundraiser for Silicon Valley Bank's president hosted a fundraiser for Mark Warner, who then went to vote to deregulate this bank. What should people take away from how these lobbyists were able to get favorable legislation here on both sides of the aisle?
I mean, so obviously the lever will often look, at the history of deregulation when some type of corporate failure happens. But I think what's really remarkable about the lobbying history in the case of Silicon Valley Bank, as well as in the case of, what lawmakers and regulators are saying, is just like how much of it turned out to be blatantly untrue. I mean, the CEO of Silicon Valley Bank wrote to the Senate in 2015, asking for carve-outs for mid-sized banks, as Silicon Valley Bank was, in some sense was, from Dodd-Frank regulations. And he was saying, the reason we should have a carve out is because there's no systemic risk here. And then, of course, on Sunday, U.S. banking regulators said there's a systemic risk posed by the collapse of Silicon Valley Bank. And these are some of the same people, like, for example, Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell, who were overseeing the deregulation of these banks in 2018, 2019, 2020. So not to, make everybody skeptical of everything happening all the time, but it was alarming to me to see just how many people said things that have turned out to be completely untrue in the past few days.
And Barney Frank, co-author of Dodd-Frank, right, sitting on the board of Signature Bank, another one of this bank also collapsed in the same catastrophe, showing a lot of the hypocrisy and just the revolving door, right, between the people doing the regulations and the banking themselves.
Right. And then, as we were talking about before, it was just in the fall that basically every bank lobbying group said we shouldn't have to pay more into the deposit insurance fund because there's not a risk of failure right now. And now banks are failing and the deposit insurance fund is being tapped. That was just a few months ago.
Yeah, I mean, we talk about this sometimes when Congress discusses tech issues, that some of their poor decision making with respect to how to regulate tech companies has to do with basic ignorance about how these institutions work. And I remember when I worked in corporate law being told sometimes, we're talking about financial instruments that only 11 people in the world understand, and here's a book, figure it out. How much of this do you think has to do with kind of financial illiteracy, if not by Congress members, but by the general public? And how much of this do you think is about maybe having too much financial literacy, in the example of Barney Frank and others who have literally worked at these institutions that they're allegedly constraining?
I mean, I think as you're gesturing to, it's a little bit of both. This is sort of an interesting bank panic in that, unlike in 2008, there's not some weird financial instrument that nobody really understands. Everything was out in the open. I mean, short sellers were talking about SVB in January. Watchdog groups were warning of the risk to banks caused by Fed rate hikes for months and months and months. So in some sense, all of this was out in the open. But I think there also, as people have been seeing a lot of on Twitter, for example, there were just some really clueless depositors who weren't doing any risk management. A lot of the depositors were tech startups with just a few employees who SVB was providing sort of substantial financial advising to. So it seems like there's a combination of lots of things being out in the open and for whatever reason, regulators not doing anything about it, as well as a lot of really incompetent Silicon Valley bros not doing any risk management.
Julia Rock, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me on.
And we'll be back with more Rising in just a minute. Stay with us.